Okay, so let's talk about one of my favorite poems, Do Not Go Gentle into the Good Night. If you have seen the movie Interstellar with Matthew McConaughey, highly recommend. It's about physics and bending time. Anyway, one of the main antagonists of that story actually references this poem several times, which we love when Dylan Thomas is referenced in pop culture. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at this poem for a couple of different things. Mainly, we're going to be looking at theme because that's what we do with every poem. But we're also going to be using this to get into authors' perspectives, i.e., how do we feel and figure out how an author feels about a subject based off of what they write. So it's kind of like reading somebody's diary. How do you know how they feel about you? Well, you kind of read between the lines, right? That's kind of the same thing with author's purpose. So we're going to be looking at how our main speaker is relevant to our main author, which ultimately is going to tie in to our theme. It's all one big domino game. So here's our objective. I can analyze a poem for theme development, perspective, mood, tone, and I can set some evidence to prove my answer. All right, here are my top 5 tips though before we look at some of these poems, because what we're going to be doing later is we're going to be looking at how this poem connects to other poems about death. Spoiler alert, it's the death poems. I mean, we're in high school literature. That's just everything is sad. And so we're going to be reading a lot of poems over the next couple of lessons. And so I want us to just look at tips to reading poetry. I will say most of the time when high school students look at poetry and they're just like, oh my God, Misty, I hate poetry. Most of the times they're doing that because they've read like one Edgar Allan Poe poem and they're like, I don't understand what the big deal is, or they didn't like Dr. Seuss when they were growing up. It's kind of falling into one of two camps. However, I like to remind my students that most all students, especially high school students, love music. They love songs. They have a favorite artist. They listen to a song on repeat over and over and over again. And my sweet friends, that is poetry. That's like the exact same thing. The only difference between poetry and songwriting is the musical composition piece. Everything else is the same. The use of the thematic language, all of the literary devices and elements, the use of speakers and narrative, all of that is seen in music. So you can't tell me you don't like poetry because, well, you listen to it every day. Anyway, so here are my tips to kind of give yourself a little bit more confidence when looking at poems. The first thing is you have to read the poem multiple times. Just like songs, you can't listen to a song once and hear all the deeper pieces of symbolism in the song, right? So one of the biggest songs right now is that Crazy Adams song. It's so good. It's like the catch you on my steely, that's your price, that's your, I don't know. That was a lot of singing coming at you very early in the morning, but um, there's a lot of symbolism in that story or in that song that I didn't even catch up on until like the 15th time I heard the music. And it's the same concept with poetry. I kind of like to illustrate poetry as like an iceberg, right? The top of the iceberg is kind of small, you can see it, but once you get like under the water, that's when the iceberg gets bigger. That's what happens when you read. The first time you read a poem, you're just reading it for rhythm. That's the only thing that is happening. The second time you read the poem, this is when you're looking for the who, what, where, when, why. This is like the summary of the poem. After that second read, you should be able to say like, are there key events? Is there a character? Who is the speaker? What is the setting, right? Those are like the things that you practice in like 5th grade. And then once you get into that third and fourth read, this is when you're actually able to start looking at, okay, I know the rhythm, I know the summary. What is the theme? What am I supposed to take away from this poem? How does the speaker feel about whatever subject they're talking about, kind of, etc. Okay, so my first tip, you've got to read the poem multiple times. Poems are short, but they pack a ton of information in there. Think about this. I mean, you have a novel, right? Or even a film. I mean, think about one of your favorite movies. Most all films are going to teach a theme, right? Love is blind, blood is thicker than water, this idea of treat others how you want to be treated, what goes around comes around, right? All of these are themes. And movies can do that in 2 hours. Books can do that in 30 chapters, but a poem can do it in 4 stanzas. I'm just saying they've mastered it. Okay, so first, read the poem multiple times. The second thing is you need to identify who the speaker is and what is the context. This is kind of what I was talking about with that second read. Ask yourself who is speaking in the poem, what is the situation, what is the setting, and because understanding the speaker and the context of the poem is really going to help provide a lot of insight into the poem's message. Next is pay attention to those literary devices. So literary devices are the things we learn in middle school. Metaphors, similes, personification, alliteration, all these poetic techniques. These used inside of poetry is going to really contribute to deeper meanings of the text overall, as well as contribute to the poem's overall effect. Okay, so think about a metaphor. A metaphor is a comparison between two things that are completely unalike, right? So her smile is the sun. What does that mean? Her smile is not physically the sun, right? Her smile is warm. It's inviting. It's full of vitality, right? Just like the sun would be. Or you could say a simile, which is a comparison of two unlike things using like or as. So you could say her eyes are like windows, right? That could be equivalent to saying like, oh, they're very reflective, or her eyes are very closed off to the world, or her eyes are hollow, because windows are hollow, right? And so again, you're just kind of using that to kind of anchor an idea down. When you see that anchor in a poem, it's our clue to pay attention to it. Next is examine the structure. I love poetry because of the structure. It's fascinating. I took a poetry class in college, and we had to look at this haiku for 30 minutes. And if you know about a haiku is 3 lines. 3. That's all. That's all it is. Okay. And looking at that for 30 minutes, that's a lot. Like, why are we still looking at this? But it was interesting because if you just read the poem once, you'd say, oh, this is a poem about the winter. But we could see that the first line was up on the right-hand side of the page. But then the last 2 lines were like way over here on the bottom left. And so there was physical distance in that structure of the poem. And so it kind of aids to the theme of not winter, but this idea of being isolated from your loved ones, this idea of this internal rest and kind of seasonal depression that happens when it's dark outside. But then also like that distance that you would feel in a strained relationship when you're living in the same house as somebody, but you don't feel connected to them. All of that can be seen because of the spacing on the page. So paying attention to the poem's form is just as important as paying attention to the literary devices, the structure, the rhythm, all of those things. Structural elements are huge. I teach in my advanced creative writing class about hermit crab essays. They're fascinating. One of the interesting things about those is they actually take the form of the theme that they're trying to present. Take, for example, if you're trying to write a piece over overconsumption, right? This idea of constantly buying something new because you're never satisfied and you're like overspending your money. Say they wrote how they felt about that and they said it was bad, etc. But they wrote it in the form to make it physically look like a receipt, right? That's kind of tying that idea of overconsumption to a receipt, because what happens when you buy a lot of stuff and you overconsume, you have a lot of receipts, right? And so you can see that poetic form, physical form, being tied into the physical theme. Okay. And then the last thing you do, you reflect on the themes that invokes, or you reflect on the emotions of the poem that invokes the larger themes that it addresses. Okay. So again, theme we know is like the kindergarten teacher. What did we learn, children? What is the universal truth? This is when you read that chapter book in elementary school and you're sitting around with your teacher. Oh, we have to be nice to our friends. Or you watch Beauty and the Beast and you're like, oh, I learned to not judge a book by its cover. The best is inside that you will discover. Right? Those are the themes. now that we're reading more complex literature, though, it's not just necessarily finding out the theme, but it's finding out how do we know that is the theme, right? It's not as easy as just saying, oh, well, that's the theme and walking away. Now we have to figure out, well, how did the author do that, right? And so that kind of goes back to the theme trackers of looking at key events could develop a theme, characters can develop a theme, thoughts, actions, setting, structure, mood, tone, symbolism, right? There's like 8 or 9 different main ways that an author can develop the theme. So let's go ahead and look at the poem. Now, again, this is written by Dylan Thomas in 1920. He is a phenomenal poet. He wrote a ton, mainly poetry, but he actually wrote a couple of literary critique essays as well. And I think he wrote 2 novellas. So really, really cool writer. I really like him. In this poem, he wrote 5 stanzas centering around the concept of death. Let's read the poem first for rhythm. We'll read it a second time for a summary, read it a third time to figure out what it is actually saying. So he says, do not go gentle into the good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into the good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in the green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men, who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late, they grieve it's on its way. Do not go gentle into the good night. Grave men, near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into the good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Let's read it again for summary. So he says, do not go gentle into the good night. Old age should rave and burn at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So what is he saying here? Well, he's saying, don't die, right? The good night is symbolic of death. And he actually uses several different terms to represent death. So good night, close of day, dying of the light, the dark, all of these, even Green Bay, all of these different phrases can be used to describe death. So he's saying, do not go gentle into death. What should you do? Have rage, rage against the dying of light. Fight death, right? Fight for your life. And he compares our first group of people. And he said, old age should burn and rave at the close of day. So he says, old men, they're not ready to die, right? They're close to death. They're older. But no, they have rage, rage against the dying of the light. They don't want to die. They want to fight death. They want to fight to live. And then he says, though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into the good night. So now we have our second type of man. So we have old men at the very beginning, and then we have wise men. And he said, these guys are smart, right? They're wise. They understand life and death. They understand it is inevitable. It is going to happen. You can't live forever. People are not immortal, right? Death is natural. But they say, these wise guys, even though they know they have to die, they don't die. Why? Because their words had forked no lightning. They haven't made the impact that they wanted. Their name isn't going to be remembered. They're so smart and they're so wise and they're doing all this stuff for math and sciences and all this stuff, but they won't be remembered. Their words forked no lightning. They didn't discover something profound yet. And so what do? They don't go gentle, right? They fight. They don't go gentle into the good night. Then we have our third type of man in stanza 3. It says, good men, the last wave by. So Thomas is kind of saying, like, there's not a lot of good guys left. Crying how bright their frail deeds may have danced in the green bay. So these guys are saying, no one will remember all the great things that I did. Like all of these wonderful things that I did. I was humble. I was selfless. I helped everyone around me. I, worked my whole life for other people. I don't want to die. I did everything in my life for everyone else. I was a good person. I was a good man. So what do? They have rage against the dying of the light. They fight death. And then we have our fourth type of man, wild men, right? Who caught and sang the sun in flight. So this is actually an allegory for the original myth of Icarus. If you've not looked up the myth of Icarus, look him up. It's crazy. Basically, he thought he was the bee's knees, flew too close to the sun and fell down, and it was tragic. But what did these wild men do? They learned too late. They grieve it's on his way. Do not go gentle into the good night. These wild men thought that they were invincible. Nothing could touch them. They are flawless. They're amazing. They can't die. They're immortal, right? They're wild. They're free. Then we have the fourth stanza, the fourth type of man, right, that are in the world. And he says that these are grave men, right? So men who are near death. So this could be potentially old, but he's already kind of referenced elder men. So we would assume this is probably more like men who have some type of terminal illness. Maybe they have cancer, maybe they have, bad cirrhosis. I mean, there's several different things that could be going on, but they are basically on death's bed, right? They're in death's doorstep. They're dying. And they say, who see with blinding sight. They see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. They understand what's on the other side. They've been on their deathbed, right? They kind of see their own mortality. But what do? They have rage against the dying of the light. Even those guys who see the light at the end of the tunnel, they literally see themselves dying. They're like, no, I'm not ready. So Dylan has 5 types of men that are all fighting death. Old men, wise men, good men, wild men, and grave men. But let's look at that last stanza. He said, and you, my Father. So who is he talking to? He's talking to his dad, right? So this is a very personalized poem. He's not just talking about people dying in general and how we should take it. No, he's talking to his dad here. And we have another metaphor of death, of sad height. He's close to dying. He's right on the edge of passing. And he urges his dad, curse, bless me now. With your fierce tears I pray. He's like, Dad, please bless me with your tears. Show me that you don't want to leave me. Show me that you're not ready to die. Please, don't go. So we're kind of getting the feeling as the reader that maybe his dad is ready to pass. We don't know what's happening with Thomas's dad, but it sounds like he has gone through his life and he's ready to die, right? And there's a lot of people like this. A lot of people get to the end of their lives and they're like, I lived a good life. I'm ready for what comes next, right? I'm ready to leave this world behind and go on to the rest. And that can be really hard for a family member to hear, this idea that your family member is ready to pass. And so we can kind of empathize a little bit with Thomas, because that would be horrible if your parent is like, just let me go, right? Let me die. And you're with them like, no, like you can't leave me. Like, where are you going to go? What am I going to do? And so we see that final repetition. And ultimately, this is the theme. He says, do not go gentle into the good night. And again, he's talking directly to his dad here. Rage against the dying of the light. So things I want us to think about. What is the theme of the poem? Well, very clearly stated several times. Do not go gentle into the good night. Rage against the dying of the light. But looking at why does the narrator include all of these different types of men? Think about what it's doing. Why didn't he just start the poem with like, hey dad, I don't want you to die. Please live for me. He didn't do that. He included all of these different types of men almost as evidence for his dad to do what? How does that help his argument? How does that help him develop the theme of don't die, right? Fight death. Fight for your life. And then looking at to that last stanza, that speaker's point of view, think about how personalized it was. The fact that he spoke directly to his dad, right? Think about what is the effect of the repetition. Whenever you're thinking about effect, you're thinking about impact, you're thinking about significance, i.e., why does the author include it? Ultimately, it can be included for several reasons. It can be included to develop a theme. It can be included, and that's why it's on our theme tracker. It can be used to develop a character. It can be used to create a mood or tone or even the speaker's perspective. Think about why did the author put it in? And if it were to be taken out, what would happen to the rest of the text? So think if we didn't have that repetition of rage, rage against the dying of the light, do not go gentle into the night. If we just had all of the other stuff, what would happen to the poem? What effect would be lost? Okay? All right, good luck. Let me see if I can figure out how to end my Zoomcast. Okay.